Let's do one more word with Professor Serhii Plokhy. He is director of the Ukrainian Research Institute at Harvard University and the author of The Last Empire, The Final Days of the Soviet Union, and the winner of the 25th annual Liner Gelber Prize for Nonfiction Writing about International Affairs. I want to take you to, as the Soviet Union is falling apart, and Boris Yeltsin, representing Russia, and Leonid Kravchuk, representing Ukraine, are having a discussion. And Yeltsin looks at Kravchuk and says, according to your book, you know, if you're going to play this card, we're going to start to talk about borders, because part of your country is actually my country. He's talking about Eastern Ukraine, which Putin just moved on, of course.
Right.
In this respect, is Putin completing a job that Yeltsin actually wanted to start 25 years ago?
Yes and no. Yes, in a sense that the agenda to bring the republics back was there for the Russian policymakers already in the fall of '91. Economic advisors were telling Yeltsin that Russia didn't have enough money to support the empire, to support Central Asian republics, other republics that needed support from the center. So Russia had to focus on itself, rebuild itself. And then it was said in 20 years the republics would come back. So that was the long-term agenda. And for a long period of time in Moscow, they believed that the Commonwealth of Independent States was actually a different name for the Soviet Union, a different way that would allow Russia to maintain control over the post-Soviet space. But at the same time, they decided that they are not going outside of the borders of the Russian Federation to bring in the republics or to force any kind of decisions on the republics. They, at the same time, decided that they would fight within the Russian Federation. And Chechnya was an example of that. Already in the fall, in October of '91, they sent for the first time Russian troops to Chechnya. It didn't work well, but they already decided, in Chechnya we are fighting, in Kiev we are not doing that. And the model was, and the vision was, of this kind of a liberal empire, that Russia, because of its economic potential, because of attractiveness of its culture, because of so many people in the former Soviet Union speak Russian, it will be the center of integration. It changed with Vladimir Putin. For the first time, it was in 2008 that the Russian troops were sent across the Russian border. And then we see also the hybrid war in Ukraine, in eastern Ukraine. We see the annexation of the Crimea. So the vision, in a certain way, that Russia should continue to be a major force in the region and that really the sovereignty of other republics is limited, was there in '91. But the readiness to use force, military force, outside of the Russian borders, this is something that came much, much later.
Putin was on the scene during the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Whose side was he on?
Excellent question, and there is no easy answer to it. Because according to Putin's own memoirs that interviews that he gave before he was elected for the first time the president of Russia, he said that he quit the KGB, and that he quit the KGB in the middle of the coup, August coup of '91. That even before that, he sent his letter of resignation, and it was in the middle of the coup that the head of the KGB gave okay to this letter. Putin's critics, including in Russia, saying that actually this is really a story that is really very unlikely. In the middle of major crisis, the head of the KGB making decision on the fate of low-ranking KGB officer. So we don't know really what the truth was. But what is clear, whatever side you take, is that certainly Putin was not anymore a loyal KGB officer back in '91. He was working together with one of the, as assistant on the, or advisor on the international relations to the democratically elected mayor of Leningrad and then St. Petersburg, Mr. Sobchak. And from that point of view, Putin was in Yeltsin's camp. But like with any officer in the Secret Service, it's really impossible task for historian to figure out on whose side Putin was really at that point in time.
He did say more recently that he thought the fall of the Soviet Union was the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. What percentage of Russians today do you think agree with that?
I think that majority would agree with that. I would also say that that was more or less the feeling of maybe, if not Putin himself, people around him in '91. I mentioned he worked together with Sobchak, and the fall of the Soviet Union in fall of '91 meant that there was no agricultural supplies anymore coming from Ukraine, from Belarus, to places like Moscow and Leningrad. They were really in the middle of major crisis, including crisis that there was no food on the shelves. And for them, for people there, the disintegration of the Soviet Union meant actually end of the economic ties that existed before that. For Russian population today, we see that after the annexation of the Crimea, the support for Putin was extremely high. So many in Russia look back at '91. They look back at the hardships of '90s and attribute that to the fall of the Soviet Union, disintegration of the Soviet Union. And more than that, many of them tend to blame the West and the United States of America in particular for causing these hardships and actually bringing the disintegration of the Soviet Union, despite the fact that American policy was very different, that it was an American interest to support the continuing existence of the Soviet Union back in 1990 and then '91.
Do you think that's the same thing as Russians missing communism?
These things are interlinked. So there is a feeling that what they lost was cheap food and apartments that they didn't have to pay for, and social security. All of that, of course, was wiped out in the 1990s. So it is this nostalgic feeling. And again, like it is here in the West, when for wrong reasons the fall of the Soviet Union, communism, and the end of the Cold War are lumped together, in the same way, the same kind of thinking we see on the Russian side. And the more the myth here persists that it is the United States that emerged victorious and wiped out the Soviet Union from the map of the world, the more there is resentment in Russia. And so there are different approaches to the myth, but myth is basically the same and is absolutely untrue in terms of reality that was happening on the ground around the time of the disintegration of the USSR.
What would you say to patriotic, potentially Ronald Reagan, George Bush loving Americans who say you are really downplaying the role America had in the end of the Soviet Union, and you are playing up too much the conflict among the different Soviet leaders of the time?
Well, America played important role in ending the Cold War, and ending the Cold War more or less according to the American script, and there is no question about that. But when it comes to the disintegration of the Soviet Union, it is a different story, and American goals there were different. And I think that if one takes into account the interest of the United States and West in general, those goals reflected those interests very much. Again, they were afraid of the nuclear war. They certainly found it to be comfortable and even profitable working with a leader like Gorbachev. So I don't think this is trying to reconstruct the course of events and the modes of thinking of the time and demythologize the past is something that really leads to undermining of either nation or belief in the potential of that nation.
Let's finish up on this. This is one of the great stories of the 20th century, the disintegration of the Soviet Union. Where were you when it happened?
I was in Canada.
What were you doing in Canada?
I was in Canada. I was invited as a visiting professor to the University of Alberta. And back then, it was August of '91. I had to come a little bit early before the start of the semester.
So you missed it by a few months.
So I went to Moscow on the 20th of August, and it was because all international travel was done through Moscow back then. And it was Moscow-Montreal plane. It left Moscow on the second day of the coup. I never thought that they actually would allow that plane to leave, but that's what happened. And then we landed in Montreal, and there was a crowd of reporters. And I later discovered that a friend of mine who was actually picking me up at the airport told them that he was meeting a friend who spoke English, and I found myself surrounded by this reporters, and I was probably one of very few people who actually not just spoke English, but decided to speak about what they saw in Moscow. We didn't know how things would go. My family was still back in Ukraine, back in the Soviet Union. So I tried to tell what I saw. I tried to be optimistic. It turned out that indeed one day later the coup was over, and Moscow was jubilant, and the rest of the Soviet Union celebrating really not Gorbachev's but Yeltsin's victory.
How disappointed
over
were
the
you
voters.
how disappointed were you that you weren't over there while all the action was happening?
Well, I saw half of the action. for the first day and a half of the coup, I was there. And the most amazing image that I still have in front of me is on the first day of the coup. A column of the vehicles, military vehicles, including tanks, are moving along the Tverskaya Street in Moscow. And there was the first McDonald's that was, and it was the Canadians who actually brought McDonald's to the Soviet Union.
George Cohen.
The first McDonald's that was there. And there is a crowd of young, educated urbanites. McDonald's was a cool place to be for people who were interested in the West. Emerging out of McDonald's and actually blocking the street and stopping the tanks. So for me, that was so symbolic, this image of people who was looking up to the West, who wanted democracy, market economy for their country, and they were the ones who actually stopped the coup.
Serhii, thank you very much. Spasiba.
Oh, Steve, thanks a lot. Дякую for inviting me.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.